Hi guys, so I find APIs quite hard to understand and I've watched many videos and they just don't seem to work for me, so I'm going to explain this in the simplest way I can. Now you don't need to know anything about coding to understand this. So you know when you go into a website and you type something into the URL bar, it takes you to the website. So for example, if I type in /SQL on this website, it takes me to the SQL homepage, and if I was to type in /Python, it would take me to the Python homepage. So what we're doing here is we're requesting the contents of this URL and they get displayed by the browser. So that's what the browser does. It serves up the content of whatever is located here. Now in the same way, you're going to request things from an API and that API is then going to give you something back. And that something will not necessarily be a website. It could be some kind of text file or an image file or whatever it is. So I am actually going to share with you an example. So to make things interesting, I'm going to actually be using an API from a game that I've been playing. I've been playing this space game called Galactic Tycoons, and in this game you fly around the universe, establish bases on different planets, and you mine resources and you sell those to other people, and you're trying to basically run a sort of space business. And you can see a bunch of different materials and different prices, and you can make wish lists, and this is essentially a shopping list for different materials. So this is just to give you some context onto what the API is actually going to do for us. So this is the game's official documentation, and you can see there's a base URL, and in the same way as we were looking at this website where you put /Python or /SQL on the end of this base URL, you can also put different things on the end of this URL and you'll get some info back. And those things that we stick on the end are known as endpoints. So let's have a look at some of these endpoints. And there's another piece of documentation here which lists all the different endpoints that are available, and it tells you the type of the endpoint. So just to go through a couple of these, you can see that there's a type of request. It's called a GET, and that just means we're actually getting data back. This is the endpoint itself, which you would stick on the end of the URL. And then there's some information about what kind of information is actually going to get returned to you. So we see the GET there, but there are also other types. And you'll see here, for example, with wish lists, you can get your wish lists, but you can also delete existing wish lists. And you can also post, which means to create a wish list or update it. So going back to the game, you can see here, this is one of my wish lists, and you could delete that wish list using this delete by providing the ID of that wish list. But where do we actually put this stuff? Like, do we put that into the browser? Well, no. What we need to do, and this is in the documentation, thankfully, is you actually have to write some code to do this. Now, don't worry if you don't know what the code means, because I will explain that. So in this case, I'm going to use Python, and the documentation actually contains a snippet of Python as an example that you can use straight away. So I'm going to open up PyCharm, which is what I use to run Python code. And then you can see here, I've got my base URL. Let's ignore this thing for now. I've got my API key. Now that API key is sort of like a password. So I've actually got that at the top of this script, and I'm not going to show that because it's unique to me and don't want to show things like passwords. So that gets packaged up into headers, and then we're going to send those headers as part of this request. So here, when it says request.get, that ties back in with the get request up here. So we're going to get some information. So let's go back to the code for a moment. And you can see this is the endpoint that we're going to make a request to. Now what I've done is I've set up a file name. And what I'm saying here is if there are no issues, then we are going to get back a JSON response, and I'm going to write that JSON to a file. Basically what I'm doing is I'm requesting data and I'm going to put that into a JSON file with this name. So if I run this just now, it's going to take a little moment. You can see data saved to matprices.json. So let's see if I can actually open up this file, matprices, and you'll see it's there. And this is what the file looks like. So you can see material ID, the name, the price, average price, and so on for a bunch of materials. That is exactly what we see up here with a bunch of materials and their prices. So that is what we would get back from making our request to the API. Now, you're probably wondering what happens if you get things wrong with this URL. What if you type in, you make a typo like this? Well, let's run the code and see what happens. It's just going to fail. So it's not going to give you anything because this URL is not valid. Going back to the documentation here. Now, if we look at the code, you can see it says if response status code equals 200. So every time you make a request to an API, it will give you some kind of status code to say, how's your request going? And 200 is the one that means success. So if I go back to the documentation, scroll down a bit, you can see they've listed the status codes. So if you don't have an API key or it's missing or invalid, then it's got 401 and so on and so forth. So the different response codes will give you some clues as to what you've done wrong if you don't get the response that you expected. So let's give an example. Let's choose material ID. So what I can do here is I'm going to copy this endpoint and just going to paste that into here. So material ID, and I'm going to make material ID X. Now we know that material ID needs to be a number, and how do we know that? Because if I go up here, it says material ID needs to be an integer, so that has to be a whole number. So if I type in X, don't really know what's going to happen, but it's not going to work. So let's find out what we get back from this. So here we have status 400. The value X is not valid. So this message is actually very helpful. It's not a 200, which means it's wrong, and it's telling us X is not valid. So that's actually a very helpful response because I now know which part of this is wrong. I can easily debug, and I'm going to change that back to 1, and hopefully we're going to get a successful response this time. Okay, that looks good, and we can actually see the contents here. If I go back to the map prices JSON file, you can see it's updated iron ore as we expected. So that's basically it, guys. That's how to make a request to an API, and that's how APIs work.